Welcome guys to another video of Parvez's Trade. And on this video, I want to talk about something which is very interesting and has been in the talks lately, especially after Trump got elected, which was can a US state secede from the Union? And so like the idea behind it is pretty simple. Like if you look at the recent electoral result of American presidential election, you have most of the west coastal states basically voting Democrat and most of the inland states voting Republican. But the Democratic, the pro uh, left wing coastal states like California, Oregon, New York, you know, New Hampshire, all of their combined GDP is equal to almost one third of American GDP. So hypothetically speaking, if the left-wing coastal states of USA decide to secede from the Union, America's GDP will shrink by a third at least overnight. Now the question comes to whether they can actually do it, right? And I think what people fail to understand is that, well, I mean, it has been challenged in the past, right? Texas tried to secede from the Union, and then the Supreme Court basically said there is no constitutional basis. And yeah, the southern states tried to secede as well during the Civil War, but there was no constitutional basis, so they had to fight an actual war, which they lost. And now the question comes down to whether these coastal states will basically just sit down and take all Trump's policies and not fight back and try to secede. And I think what's interesting is because um, like recently, Mr. Trudeau of Canada, he traveled to Mar-a-Lago to meet Mr. Trump. And Trump jokingly, whether though I'm not sure if it was a joke or not, but Trump basically said to Trudeau that if Canada wants to avoid the 25% tariff that Trump is trying to levy on Canadian exports to US, Canada should just join the union, become the 51st state of USA. And I know it sounds like a joke, but the underlying meaning behind that is very, very important, which is that the fundamental reason the Union was formed, if you go back to the founding fathers of America, you go back to the Boston Tea Party Rebellion, and what was the fundamental reason why the Boston Rebellion happened? The Tea Party Rebellion, where the revolutionaries basically, hijacked British ships of imported tea and they threw them out in the sea, right? What was the fundamental concept behind that rebellion? So the British government, which had basically the authority over all the colonial states in US back then, they were imposing a tariff on all tea imported into USA. And the US states did not want that. They wanted to work and live in a tariff-free environment. They were consuming large amounts of tea, and they didn't want to pay the tariff on the tea that was imported into USA. That's basically what led to the rebellion. And now, I mean, contrast that with what's going on right now. I mean, Trump is trying to tariff all imports that come into USA. Think about it. Um, the British government was the federal authority, you can say back then, before USA was formed. And they decided to use their authority to tariff imports into USA. And the Americans were not having it. And then they rebelled against it. And now you have a guy like Trump who's basically doing a very similar thing, right? is trying to tariff imports into USA. But the fundamental difference is a lot of Americans are pro-tariff right now because they elected Trump. Because they believe that this will help to bring manufacturing back to USA by making imported products more expensive. But the reality on the ground is that it will just make consumer goods more expensive. And I talked about this in a previous video. And yeah, so like, what is if coastal left-wing coastal states like New York and California, if they decide to secede from the Union, there's no constitutional basis on it behind it. So it has to be done through force. It has to be done through a revolution. And obviously, these states do not have any military uh, force that can match the US federal army, right? But at the same time, most of American army is stationed outside America. Now, this goes back to the famous uh, invasion of Rome. So this Roman legion, this part of the Roman army, which formed their own legion, their own group, and the Roman legion basically were attacking the Roman city, and they were driving their way into Rome, and on the way they saw no Roman military. Okay, because most of Roman military was stationed in the border states, it was stationed in faraway land, fighting foreign wars. So even though Rome had a big army, their army was not there to protect Rome when Rome was invaded by these dissatisfied legions and these barbarians, as they were called. And yeah, when these invaders went through Rome, they saw a bunch of people who were extremely poor, but they didn't face any Roman army because Roman army, even though it was big and powerful, it wasn't there inside Rome. It was it was fighting foreign wars outside Rome. And even now, yeah, I mean, America has over 800 military bases outside America. And most of American soldiers are stationed outside America. And most of America's uh, army resources are deployed outside America. So, yeah, I mean, on paper, this if these left-wing coastal states want to secede from the Union, they can't do it through the Constitution because there's no constitutional basis. They have to do it through force. But then on paper, they don't. They're nowhere close to the federal army. Uh, they're outmatched by the federal army, right? But in reality, the federal army is not even stationed, most of it in America. So, and the interesting part about Canada becoming the 51st state, well, this is where I think it gets interesting because on the one hand, the fundamental idea behind forming the Union of the States in America was that they didn't want to be tariffed on their imports from abroad. And notes had taxation without representation. If they were taxed like that, they at least should have representation. So compare that to what's happening right now in America. Yes, Trump got elected. Yes, they have the Senate and the House and the Supreme Court. So there is some level of representation and backing behind this tariff idea. But the left-wing states can argue that they are the ones that are going to get hit the most with this tariff. Look, the coastal states, most of them are left-wing, except you have Florida and Texas, right? And yeah, most of the coastal states are left-wing. A significant amount of the revenue generated by the coastal states comes from operating the ports, the naval ports, the trading ports. Okay. If you tariff your imports, the trading activity will drop, the revenue will drop. So these left-wing states can argue that we are getting hit at a disproportionate level by these tariffs because our trading port revenue is dropping because the trading activity is dropping because high tariffs means less traders are incentivized to import. And so like what happens in that kind of situation, right? If you think about it. And I mean, right now, obviously there's no tariff between any of the states inside USA, right? Can um, produce and sell products to different states inside the USA and not have to face any tariff. I mean, there's provincial taxes, different taxes and all that. That's true, but there's no significant tariff to transfer goods from one state to another in USA. But what if the left-wing states decide to retaliate and then tariff any products coming into their states from the Republican states? Then the fundamental idea of the forming of the union basically comes into question because the entire idea of forming the union of USA was that the states can trade and collaborate with each other freely. And yeah, so, and then you come to the idea of Canada becoming a US state. Well, I know Canadians very well, as much as they are pro USA, they have very fundamental different values compared to USA. I'm very confident about that. And so I'm very confident that they will not uh, decide, they will not want to be a part of USA. I'm very confident about that. No, this is where it gets tricky because then how does Trudeau handle this tariff, this 25% tariff? Because it's now going to become a big deal. Because Canada has an election next year, so this is going to become a big deal, right? Yeah. And so what does Trudeau do? I mean, he can try to seek out other trading partners in Asia. But look, most of Canada's trade is with USA. That is not going to change anytime soon. They're seeking out new trading partners in Asia and other places in Europe. They can try and do that, but it's not going to be as efficient as selling to USA market. So, I mean, what are the scenarios you're looking at, right? Because I mean, scenario one is Trudeau takes the line down, he lets the tariffs go through, lets the trading activity gets hit, Canadian exports get hit, Canadian economy activity drops significantly before the Canadian election next year. What's another option? He tries to negotiate a deal with Trump, but Trump is not going to. I mean, Trump is talking about border controls, drug smuggling, but that will not happen overnight. Okay, that's something you cannot control overnight and change overnight. And another scenario could be that Trump forces Canada to buy more American products, but I don't see how that's happening. Canada already buys a significant amount of their import is from USA. Well, then Trudeau might decide, okay, let me tax the imports that come in from USA, but then that will pick up inflation in Canada. And really want to do that before another election in Canada. I mean, right? So retaliating hurts his consumer base in Canada. It does hurt American producers who are exporting to Canada. But I don't think Trump will care about that. He's just getting into his presidency. He'll want to use the first 2 years to fight as many battles as he can. So I don't think he'll care if Trudeau tariffs Canadian imports from USA. But I think that's what Trudeau will do. So even though putting tariffs on Canadian imports from USA will hit Canadian consumer base, I think that's exactly what Trudeau is going to do because it'll basically rally his liberal voting base who hates Trump anyway. And yeah, it'll pick up it'll push inflation up in the short run and he'll get blamed for it. But I think Canadian economic activity is dropping at such a rate that it will have very minimal effect. Look, We talked about this in a previous video. Canadian household debts are at a record level. Okay. Their household debts are at a record level, and the GDP growth is dropping significantly. And the Canadian Bank of Canada is cutting rates very fast because they realize the economy is not as strong as they initially thought it was. People are leaving Canada in the left and right. And you have all these Canadian MPs talking about how all this. Look, this is where I think Canadians, especially Canadian leaders, because they're getting into all this tribal politics, they're not understanding the fundamental economics. Like recently, the Conservative Party, especially there, and the Bloc Québécois, they're focused on how, millions of temporary residents in Canada are gonna, their work permits, study permits are going to expire next year, and they're focused on whether these people will leave Canada. Look, Canadian citizens born and raised in Canada, immigrants in Canada, legal immigrants in Canada, they're all leaving. Okay. And you're focused on pushing away the temporary residents uh, who are going to leave anyway. It just shows you um, how far they're away from reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground is, and I've talked to Canadians on this, people from five, fifth, sixth, seventh generation Canadians who were born and raised there, they're leaving Canada. Immigrants who immigrated to Canada legally, they're leaving Canada. People on PR, people work so hard to get a PR in Canada, and they're deciding, fuck it, I don't want uh, I don't want basically the Canadian citizenship, and now they're deciding to leave Canada. And so you have so many people leaving Canada on a regular basis, and this number is not quantified. And you are worried about the temporary residents who might not leave Canada after their residence expires. It just shows you the naivety and the egotistical overestimation of these Canadian leaders about the economy. Because, like it or hate it, the people that are going to leave Canada, whether they're born and raised Canadians or immigrants or people on PR or temporary residents, the people that are leaving Canada are actually the ones that are the most active. Okay. Because you have to understand the mentality of someone who's leaving Canada. They're leaving Canada because they're smart enough to see what's going on. They're smart enough to see that the middle class is collapsing and that this housing cost, inflation cost, this is not going to be solved with some policy red tape cut or whatever anytime soon. So you have to understand the kind of person that's leaving Canada. It's the kind of person that is smart and that is active enough to follow the rest of the world politics, that is smart enough to realize they can make more money and improve their net wealth more by moving to places like Dubai, Asia, where taxes are low and housing and living costs are cheap. So it's the smart people that are deciding to leave Canada. And they're the ones who are driving the Canadian economy to first in the beginning. And they're not just leaving themselves and packing a bag, they're moving the capital with them. They're selling their houses and moving the capital with them, taking their capital with them, right? And you're focused on the temporary residents that might not leave. And look, I'm not trying to hate the people who are staying in Canada after all this. But again, you have to understand the kind of people, after all of this is happening, they're still deciding to stay in Canada. Why? Because they're not very competitive. Okay. They realize they can live a lazy life, get some EI insurance benefits, get all those, workers' rights benefits, and not be competitive and still um, get along. Okay, so it's the people who are competitive. They don't want the EI benefits, the employment insurance benefits, the unemployment benefits. They don't want the government handouts. They're deciding I can make more on my own, uh, as by moving to another country and not being taxed heavily by the government. But the people who rely heavily on the Canadian government, they are not going to leave Canada because once you leave Canada, you're not going to get those government handouts. So the kind of people who are staying in Canada after all of this is the kind of people who are getting those government handouts. competitive people, smart people who realize they can make more money on their own, they don't need a government helping hand, they're leaving Canada. So you have the more people as a percentage of your population who are drawing money from the government, and the people who are actually contributing to your economy are leaving. So what do you end up with? You end up with a weaker economy, right? The people who are driving the Canadian economy, they're leaving, so the economy drops, like economic activity drops. And the people who are pulling down the economy by taking these government handouts, they're staying. And so the economy drops even further, economic activity. And on top of this, you have these tariffs getting hit. And I think Trudeau understands that very well. And I think what he's trying to do is he'll tariff, if Trump doesn't back down, he's going to tariff imports from USA, even if that drives up inflation in Canada. Because Trudeau realizes the kind of people that are still staying in Canada, the kind of liberals that are still staying in Canada, are the kind of liberals that are getting government handouts and that cannot. So, look, if you're a Canadian who is pro government handout, you receive a lot of government support, government workers' right, and all that, you like the Liberal Party. Let's not kid ourselves. And you will not be upset if your grocery bill increases a bit because Trudeau tariffs Canadian imports from USA. And the reason I believe that it will not have too much upward inflationary pressure on Canadian uh, consumer goods by tariffing US imports into Canada is because the people who are driving Canada's economy, the Canadians who are leaving Canada, they're removing a lot of upward inflationary pressure on Canadian consumer goods, if that makes sense. So you have people who are driving Canada's economy, who are competitive, who don't need government handouts. Okay, they're leaving. And so they're with them, they're taking away a lot of the inflationary pressure on the Canadian groceries and consumer goods. And the people who are remaining are not contributing too much to the economy. They're taking government handouts, so they're pro-liberal party in a lot of cases. And so the drop in inflationary pressure because of this competitive economic activity from the Canadians that are leaving versus a bit of upward inflationary pressure because of tariffing US imports into Canada. I think Trudeau will see how the equation works out, and I think he'll bet on not having tariffing US imports not having a high effect on inflationary pressure upward. And so I think Trudeau will tariff US imports into Canada if Trump doesn't back down. Because with an election coming up in Canada next year, Trudeau is not going to take this lying down. That's just my personal take on it. And now going back to our initial question, whether the coastal states will try to secede from the Union, they'll definitely fight the federal government because they have a lot to lose with this tariff war. Trading activity drops, the revenue from the trading ports in coastal states drop, and these left-wing coastal states are already struggling with getting state-level revenue. They'll definitely fight the U.S. government, the federal government, no doubt, in court and all that. Um, can they actually try to leave the union? There's no constitutional basis on it, but it's all about finding the right opportunity. Okay, what will force Trump's federal government to come to the table to the rescue of these bankrupt left-wing coastal states? A war, a foreign war, where the US federal military will be occupied fighting foreign wars. And so they cannot, at that point, afford a secession contest inside USA. So yeah, a lot of dynamics have to work at the same time. And if Canada tariffs imports from USA, well, yeah, so as I was talking about it, if Trudeau wants to go after Trump and the Republican Party, let's look at the US states that export the most to Canada. And you can easily see that You have Michigan, which is a swing state, and they export $29 billion. They'll get hit if Trudeau decides to tariff those imports coming from Michigan into Canada, automobiles and auto parts. Texas is second, another Trump state. They'll get hit. Okay. They export close to $30 billion. Ohio, another swing state, that'll get hit. Plastics, rubber, machinery. And then you have Illinois. And yeah, I mean, Trudeau can avoid them by, basically not tariffing agricultural soybean products. That's a Democratic state. New York, mainly electronics and machinery. I mean, yeah, Trudeau can basically be specific on these tariffs and not go after the Democratic states. California as well, Trudeau can make sure that the tariffs don't hit the almond wine, computers industry, right? Pennsylvania, swing state, they export chemicals into Canada. They can get hit. Indiana, Republican, and then you have Minnesota and Washington. So basically, if you have then figured it out, if Trudeau wants to surgically hit Trump's and his voting base, because Trump is coming after Trudeau and Canadian voting base, Trudeau can tariff the Republican or swing states that who are most of the top exporters to Canada. You saw the top list. The top 10 exporters are most of them are Republican or swing states. And most of their exports to Canada are not consumer goods. Most of the Republican and swing states, they export mostly industrial goods to Canada. And people who work in those chemical, petrochemical, um, machinery industry, they're not liberal voting base. I'm not trying to be stereotypical, but the liberal voting base is basically people in consulting, people in the environmental industry. And so Trudeau can easily go after Trump's voting base and not hit his liberal voting base with inflationary pressure. Yeah, so that's something interesting I wanted to talk about, and I'll come back with another video soon. And until then, peace.